managed to log over 4,000 dives around the world, and I've dived on, as I only recently worked out, I've dived on every continent except Africa, including Antarctica, which is, I guess, introduces my main passion of diving, which is not so much the tropical reefs that everyone's familiar with, although they're pretty fantastic, but I really like cold water diving. And so diving around icebergs, as was seen in the last photo, with leopard seals in water down to minus 1.5, I find really interesting. But temperate waters like here in Tasmania and Canada are really a passion. This is from Vancouver Island. It's a little spiny lumpsucker. It's only a couple of centimetres long, and it's just one of the little magical creatures that you can see. I've done a lot of diving in Canada. Not only do you see little critters like lumpsuckers, but these ancient sponges, just in focus, which the sponge that you just saw was the size of a VW beetle and hundreds of years old. And if you simply touch it with your hand, you'll kill the entire sponge, which is a really weird thing for a sponge, because those of you who have done biology know that you can strain them through a strainer and they're supposed to survive, but these particular ones are just very fragile. This is a place at the north of Vancouver Island called Browning Wall, which is supposedly one of the best dives in North America. And I wouldn't argue with that. The colours, the invertebrates, the sponges and anemones and soft corals are just amazing, and it's a really great part of the world. There are huge anemones. These are a metre long Metridian anemones. Everything seems to be bigger in Canada, and it's probably a bit sad as far as I'm concerned, because when you travel you're supposed to go and see somewhere new. I go and travel and I go to Canada where it's temperate, it's rocky reef covered by invertebrates. We see similar things here in Tasmania, but everything's just a little bit off. It's just a little bit bigger, or it's a little bit different, and so it's kind of interesting, but it's the same sort of environment that we have here in Tasmania. This is called a grunt sculpin. It's about 3.5 centimetres long, and it crawls around on the bottom with its fins and grunts at things. Okay. There are giant nudibranchs in Canada. This one's about 30 centimetres long, so for those of you who don't know, giant nudibranchs are big sea slugs. Wolf eels, a couple of metre longs. These are big fish with big teeth which eat sea urchins. One of the things I really like about diving is seeing unusual things. This is a fish called a ratfish. Now, they actually aren't that uncommon in Canada. This group of fish, they split off from sharks about 400 million years ago. They were an ancient group of fish. They were very widely established when dinosaurs started to get their act together. And I just thought I'd show this photo because, even the commonplace underwater sometimes makes a dive something quite extraordinary. Usually ratfish swim around on the bottom, and this particular one, for some reason, was up off the bottom in mid-water. And it was also quite friendly. It didn't seem to worry that I was swimming around, and I spent about half an hour swimming around with this little ratfish. It's about 70 centimetres long, just photographing it, and it was just a really unusual experience. One of the things that I really like about Canada are marine mammals. This is a little harbour seal. Usually they're very shy and it's very unusual to get close to them, but this particular individual, a bit like the ratfish, was curious about me and saw me swimming around in the kelp forest and decided to come up and check me out. Probably one of the more impressive animals that you see in Canada are Steller sea lions. I showed you a leopard seal earlier. Leopard seals are big, confident, impressive seals. They grow to 3.5 metres long. They eat other seals. They've even killed a couple of divers over the years. Steller sea lions makes leopard seals look like pussycats. These things, they grow over 3.5 metres long and 1,500 kilos. When you see them in the water, it's just a wonderful experience. These are big wild animals. You can get very close to them. They don't really mind you too much. Sometimes they start to pull your flippers and interact a bit enthusiastically, I guess. I guess when I first started diving in Canada 20 years ago, I used to try and get people to take me out to see Steller sea lions, and no one would. They thought it was too dangerous. But they actually behave very similar to our seals here in Tasmania, except they're about 3 times bigger. So there's a bit of a comfort level dealing with these animals, and I guess I'm reasonably comfortable with them. Even when they start, and this is a little pup, by the way, you can put your hand up in the water and they'll come and pull your fingers, and they aren't trying to bite you. I mean, these seals actually kill other seals too for food, but they just like interacting with this curious little visitor which has come into their world. Occasionally it does become overwhelming. This was actually a quiet time during one dive when I could actually hold my camera out and take a selfie. Most of the time all I could see was seal fur. Literally all I could see was seal fur through my mask because I was just, surrounded by so many seals. This is the typical kill move of a seal eating another seal, but anyway, they actually do it for fun with me at least. I guess they do it to each other as well as part of their fun and games in the water. But these are just incredible, amazing, impressive creatures. Okay. Look, I've talked a bit about cold water diving in the Antarctic and cool temperate in Canada. The tropics, of course, near Australia are amazing. The sponge gardens in the Solomon Islands, the sharks in the Solomon Islands, the tropical north of Australia, where clownfish and all the sorts of typical tropical type things that we see here in Indonesia and along the Barrier Reef and out in the Coral Sea. These are some manta rays near Komodo. It's a truly beautiful place. It's a wonderful place to visit if you ever get a chance to dive on a tropical reef. It's always worth taking that chance and going with it. I have to say, as a photographer though, diving in the tropics always feels a little bit, I guess, uninspiring. And I probably shouldn't say that, but the reason I say that is because people have been diving in the tropics for so long, and it's very hard to take a photo which someone else hasn't already taken, or go to somewhere where no one else has gone. Even though, in the Solomon Islands, I have to say, some of the trips I do there, we do dive in places where no one's dived before. But I find in the temperate waters and cooler waters of the world, it's a bit easier to actually go out and experience things which no one else has ever done before, see things which no one else has done before, and to try and then interpret that in a sort of a photographic sense, I think is a little bit more rewarding. Even though, the last time I was in the Solomon Islands on a 12-day trip on a boat, I did 60 dives, and every one of them was amazing. But having said that, it's great to get back into cooler waters. I'm sure you all know what that was, black swan back here in Australia, Tasmania. You've probably seen that scene as well. The mountains and forests in Tasmania are an amazing part of our environment. But there's also a really great part of our environment which is much less well known, and that's the marine environment. And that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about from now on. A really typical thing to see underwater in Tasmania are the rocky reefs covered by marine plants called macroalgae. And the southern waters of Australia have probably more species of these seaweeds or kelps or macroalgae, if you want to be a scientist, than any comparable area anywhere else in the world. And a lot of those are found here in Tasmania. Very typical scene. It's a bit like land, of course, where you get a little bit of vegetation. It forms a habitat and things live in amongst the vegetation. This is kind of a vista across a typical East Coast rocky reef, and you can sort of see the wider scenery. But living in amongst the kelp, there are things like red velvet fish, wrasse, and there's a whole variety of different fish living on rocky reefs. The previous fish was a blue-throated wrasse. The last fish was a scorpion fish, and these are male cowfishes. And believe it or not, these male cowfishes, which are about 15 to 20 centimetres long. These are engaged in fierce battle. When I took this photo, they are basically competing during the mating season. We have one of the biggest species of octopus in the world. The ones that we get here can grow to over 2 metres across, pretty commonly. I have talked to one marine scientist who believes we actually get the northern Pacific octopus, which is the same one that you get on Vancouver Island and the northern Pacific area here in Tasmania, but I haven't had that confirmed. I do remember many years ago seeing an absolutely enormous octopus here in Tasmania, but I wasn't sure what the species were when I saw it, so I couldn't say for sure. One of the sad things about global warming, unfortunately, is that large octopus don't do very well in warm water. The warmer the water, the greater their rate of oxygen use, so a really big octopus actually struggles just to stay alive, and so obviously with climate change and warming waters, the larger octopus around Vancouver Island in particular are becoming more and more scarce. This is another monster animal from Tasmania. This is the giant cuttlefish, the largest species of cuttlefish in the world. These are wonderful animals to see. They have skins which change colour over the space of a second or two. Seahorses, we have very big seahorses. Most people get excited by seeing a seahorse a couple of centimetres long. Our seahorses are 30 centimetres long and are reasonably common. Sea dragons, found nowhere else in the world. This is a weedy sea dragon. Our sea dragons here in Tasmania are very colourful and very big and pretty common. And quite interesting, they're sort of like a stretched out version of a seahorse. We have the biggest stingray in the world. In fact, our two species that we find here in Tasmania, the black and the smooth stingray, are the two biggest stingrays in the world. Getting to be a bit more exciting, this is a 7-gill shark in the Tamar River, and this is a fairly serious big shark, but it's an interesting part of the marine environment. On soft sediments, this is a stargazer. I guess when I take photos, I try and borrow from portrait techniques for people. Yes, I have seen people look a bit like that. You try and get the eyes to make contact with the viewer, and there's sort of tricks of the trade that you use when you're taking photos of animals as well as people, which make the photo and the subject a bit more engaging. We have this little creature, which a lot of you have probably heard of, the spotted handfish, found only in the southeast. One of the few marine species in the world which is at risk of becoming extinct. The red handfish, found along the east coast of Tasmania, very unusual to see red handfish. These are little fish around 12 to 15 centimetres long. This particular species lives on rocky reefs, and as we'll see later, it's as the habitat. Maybe we could go back to that slide. As the rocky reef habitat disappears, then the habitat for this little species will disappear. Handfish are, I guess, also at risk from climate change because they've found at the bottom end of Tasmania these two species and a couple of other species as well, nowhere else in the world. So as water's warm, it becomes too warm for these species. They may not do very well physiologically, or other species, or the habitat may change, other species may take over. And of course, they really have nowhere to go. If they move south, they move off Tasmania into the Southern Ocean, where there's no shallow rocky reefs for them to live on. And so that impact of climate change may be a very serious issue for these wonderful little fish, which like sitting on the reef and walking around on their hand-like little fins. Okay, thanks. The thing people talk about in biology is charismatic megafauna and big, cute, cuddly, exciting animals like the seals that we've seen. We get dolphins here in Tasmania. I guess I've been lucky enough to see dolphins quite a bit over the years. They aren't as in your face as seals, but they are always good to see. We get whales. Probably the typical whale off Tasmania is a southern right whale. These are big whales. this is a mother and her calf, and to give you a bit of an idea as to how big the mother is, the little calf in that photo, if her tail was touching the partition over there, her nose would be around about where I am. And I can be really confident about that because that's how big they are when they're just born. The mother there is around 18 metres long and probably weighs somewhere in the order of 90 tonnes. Like dolphins, believe it or not, they actually take a bit of an interest in people from time to time, and I've actually had right whales come up and eyeball me and look and swim around and check me out, and that's quite an extraordinary thing. In fact, when you're in the water with a right whale and one swims past you, I always find it hard to get my head around the fact that this moving wall is actually something that's alive. And then when you're on the surface right next to a right whale when it breathes, it's like someone blowing a trumpet beside your ear. It's the scale of life of a whale like this is a really interesting thing. Look, you can probably tell I have a thing for seals, and the seals here in Tasmania are just brilliant. They're a little bit easier to manage than the ones in Canada, but they behave pretty much the same way. We get the big males here. These can grow around 3 metres long and 600 or 700 kilos. These are big, serious animals as well, but they aren't quite as playful as the little pups. The pups are the ones that are really great to interact with, sub-adults and juveniles. And again, you'll be swimming along and something will pull your flipper, and with a bit of luck, it's a seal, and not something bigger with bigger teeth. So, and when they start to do this, they're starting to interact with you. This is what they do with each other. They play games, they chase each other and pull each other's flippers. And so when they start to do this, you sort of start to feel like one of the pack, I guess. One of the coolest, or I've had this experience a couple of times, one of the coolest times with seals is when you go out and the pups are just starting to get into the water off a seal colony. And so on this occasion I swam up and I noticed a little seal sitting on a rock, putting his face down through the water, checking me out. And he wasn't quite sure whether I was safe to get in the water with. He was, look, I'm a big, weird-looking thing. The seals had probably never seen a human being before, let alone a diver. So they were a bit cautious and they were looking down through the water. And then a couple of seconds later, they started to relax and get a bit more comfortable, and I could get quite close, and there were lots of little faces coming down through the water and checking me out. And then within the space of a couple of minutes, I had all these little seals swimming around, following me around and playing and having a grand old time. Again, a bit like the seals we saw in Canada, the Australian fur seals, they are interactive. They like pulling your fins and fingers and stuff. And I don't know what it is about me, but I seem to be a bit of a target for seals, and they tend to like biting my head. Anyway, just as a comparison, though, this is the Canadian version of the Australian version. The photo we saw before. Okay. So seals, seal colonies, they're wonderful animals to interact with, and they seem to enjoy interacting with you as well. They're wild animals. They haven't seen people before. They aren't being fed. They just play around with each other, and if you happen to be in the water at the right place at the right time, you'll have these sorts of interactions. One of the coolest parts of diving in Tasmania are the deep water reefs. As I said earlier, the rocky reefs in the shallows are covered by underwater plants, macroalgae, but once you get down to around 25 metres or 30 metres on the east coast, the light levels drop and the plants don't do so well, and instead of plants, the rocky reef becomes covered by things like sponges, those long stringy things called sea whips, and anemones, invertebrate animals which live attached to the rocks, a bit like plants, but they don't need sunlight to photosynthesise and survive. They basically are filter feeders. They filter plankton and nutrients out of the water, and they form these incredibly dense, incredibly colourful habitats. The deeper reef extends beyond just 30 metres, and one of the things I've been doing over the last 20 years, but particularly the last 10 years, is doing what's called technical diving. And technical diving using closed circuit rebreathers. With normal scuba, you probably know that you've got a cylinder of air on your back, or sometimes nitrox, which is air with a bit of added oxygen in it, and you're basically breathing air in and blowing it out into the water, and you're fairly limited in depth and certainly in time, because as you breathe in and then breathe out, you're blowing this gas from the cylinder out into the water where it's wasted. This is a dive at 70 metres on a wreck called the Tasman down off the Tasman Peninsula. With normal recreational scuba diving using compressed air, the depth limit, the extreme depth limit is around 40 metres. So the sorts of diving that we're doing is sort of beginning at 40 metres, and often, as in this place, the bottom, the reef, doesn't come up any shallower than 65 metres. And so we've been doing some quite interesting dives using a thing called a rebreather. Now, a rebreather is a fairly complicated device which basically, when you breathe out, the gas that you're breathing, instead of being blown out into the water, is recirculated through the device. The CO2 is scrubbed out by a scrubber material. The device adds oxygen, the oxygen that you've metabolised, and so you can have a very long run time underwater. So instead of being limited to an hour or so at, say, 18 metres, with a rebreather you might be able to spend several hours at that sort of depth. The other thing that rebreathers do is they make it economic to breathe helium. Helium's quite an expensive gas. You can breathe it using open circuit, but a single dive might cost $250 to use helium, and there are other reasons why it's not terribly useful as well to dive it with open circuit. So what we're doing is we're breathing using rebreathers. We have a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen and helium. You need the helium to make the gas a bit easier to breathe at depth, because the deeper you go, the greater the pressure, the greater density of the gas. But probably the most important reason is that the deeper you go breathing air, the more narcotic the gas becomes to breathe. So that means that by the time you get down to 30 or 40 metres, you're starting to feel a little bit as though you had a couple of whiskies. And the deeper you go, the more serious that narcotic effect becomes, until it seriously compromises your ability to react to the environment, and you can even pass out. And anyway, so this dive is on a wreck at 70 metres, and there's a group of about half a dozen of us. I started diving on rebreathers about 10 years ago, and now there's a group of about half a dozen of us which are doing these deep dives and seeing amazing underwater sponge gardens and reefs where no one has ever been before. One of the things that we've come across are black corals. These, particularly around the 70 metre mark, these can grow to 2 metres high. They're basically big sea fans, and people really weren't aware that these were part of the marine environment in this sort of depth range. The other thing that's pretty interesting for me, as a sort of someone who's been trained in marine biology, that pink stuff on the rock is a kind of a soft coral. I'm not sure that anyone's ever described it, so it's probably a new species. But just the colours and the shape of the marine environment, the habitat is quite an interesting place if you're into biology. It's a fairly technology-intensive activity. You can see you've got a rebreather. There's a guy there with a scooter which tows him around with a camera on it, and it's all starts to get a bit complicated. One of the downsides of doing these deep dives is that you can't simply ascend to the surface directly. You might have heard of decompression sickness or the bends. When you're in deeper water, in fact when you're underwater at any time, because of the greater pressure, you're getting more gas dissolved into your tissues, and when you ascend, that gas wants to come out as the pressure's being reduced. If you go deep enough and long enough, you basically have to slow your ascent or do stops on the way back to the surface to stop the bubbles coming out and bubbling and causing problems. As you might imagine, having bubbles passing around your blood system and getting into your brain and organs is probably not a good idea. So, these sorts of dives, if we were to ascend directly to the surface, we'd basically die. So on these dives, we're basically doing a half-hour dive in 70 metres of water, and we're spending 90 to 120 minutes decompressing on the way back up, hanging out. So anyway, that's sort of my diving career, but I thought I'd talk a bit about some environmental issues, just to throw a bit of a different complexion on things. These are giant boarfish, and I must say that there was a little school of these at Bishonow a few years ago, and I've never seen them in Tasmania before or since, but it's a symptom of climate change. There's quite a few things starting to appear on the east coast which aren't usually there or aren't usually there in numbers. This is a Port Jackson shark, pretty common on the north coast and on the mainland, occasionally seen on the east coast, but these are becoming more and more common on the east coast. If you keep your eyes out open, and you'll see little things like one-spot pullers. These are a very typical species from New South Wales, and they're starting to become quite established in Tasmania. One of the victims of climate change are the giant kelp forests, Macrocystis pyrifera. These used to be such a huge feature of the Tasmanian marine environment, to the extent that it actually supported an industry where these plants were harvested in the late 60s and early 70s. These are an amazing kind of habitat. If you can imagine being weightless and swimming through a forest and being able to swim or fly through a forest that's 20 metres high, that's what it was like when these forests were common on the east coast. They were all along the east coast. As far as I'm aware at the moment, there's one remaining little patch, maybe 100 metres across, up in the northeast. Fortescue Bay used to be completely packed out with Macrocystis, to the point where I still remember the very first dive I did off the boat ramp at Fortescue Bay, and if you've done any walking down there, you've probably walked right past it. And you'd swim out under the kelp forest, and the kelp was so dense that you literally couldn't see the surface because of the kelp. In fact, you couldn't even swim to the surface because the kelp was growing so dense. And the plants themselves, if you've seen these plants, you'll know that they have a sort of a holdfast on the bottom, which it's not really a root system, but it sort of sticks them to the rock. And as the plants get older, the holdfasts get bigger and bigger. So I can still remember holdfasts that were over 1 metre high. So they must have been there for, hundreds of years to have a holdfast that big. And anyway, in the last 30 or so years, the kelp forests have basically declined and disappeared. Why are they doing it? Well, it's a bit of an open question still. I think climate change has a lot to do with it. Not so much because of temperature, but because the warmer water which is coming down is also a bit nutrient poor. The other thing are sea urchins, and we'll say more about sea urchins later on, but they probably prey on these or graze on these plants as well. So this is a complete habitat on the east coast of Tasmania, which has basically disappeared in the last 25 years. The plants themselves are beautiful. It's the experience of swimming through a kelp forest is like walking through a majestic old growth forest on land, I think. There's lots of critters and things in the forest. One of the problems with environmental management, and certainly in the marine environment, when you talk about fishing and just the experience of being there, there's a thing called shifting or sliding baselines. To explain this briefly, what it means is that when people start to experience an environment, they sort of think, well, that's what is normal in the environment. And I must say I'm as guilty as that of having this experience as probably anyone. But to illustrate it, if someone goes for a dive now and they see how few rock lobsters there are, or that there's no kelp forest, they start to think, well, this is what it's always been like. This is what it was like 100 years ago. That's what it's going to be like in the future. In fact, as you've seen with the disappearing kelp forest, and as I'll say later on, other species that are in decline, it's actually a very different experience diving and experiencing the marine environment now than what it was when I started diving in the 70s, or even in the late 80s. Things have changed a lot. When I first started diving as a horrible little kid, when I was snorkelling, I used to collect crayfish and abalone and spear banded morwong and bastard trumpeter. And so I was quite a hunter-gatherer when I was a teenager. And I guess in the day that was fairly acceptable, and it was, in in some circles today it still is. But what it means is that those red dots represent places where I used to go fishing and where I used to see these animals in abundance. Coming back a few years later, you can see in 2004, basically I go back to those same areas and the experience is still the same today. And they've basically all disappeared from these areas. Now, if you started diving back in the late 90s or the 80s or the 70s, you would have seen that shift. But a person who's just come into the marine environment now won't know that things have changed. And unfortunately, a lot of the science didn't start happening until the 90s. So a lot of the changes which occurred very drastically over the course of the 80s haven't actually been picked up by scientists. I said I was as guilty of this as other people. I used to work for a guy who used to be an ab diver, and he used to tell me how striped trumpeter were a really common thing that you could catch off the jetties along the east coast. And anyway, by the time I got into the marine environment, they had all been fished out, and now striped trumpeter are really a deep water fish which is seen out in 30, 40, 50 metres plus of water, not off the end of jetties on the east coast. So, and I had that sort of mental realisation that his experience of the marine environment was different again from mine. But I think that the shift has been even greater during the course of my lifetime. The biggest thing which is going on in the marine environment at the moment, except possibly for aquaculture in some areas, is the spread of the long-spined sea urchin, Centrostephanus rodgersii. These urchins are fine if there's only a few of them, but when they start to build up in numbers, they start to graze on the kelps, the macroalgae, the seaweeds, and basically leave bare rocks and remove the normal kelp habitat. The range of these things are very well established all along the east coast and have been found around to Port Davey. But that red indicator on the map, if you can see that, is where urchin barrens are really causing huge environmental change.
Where did they come from?
Well, it's a good question. They're normally part of the environment, believe it or not. They're very well established in New South Wales. I saw them in the early 80s in Fortescue Bay, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting animal, and didn't think any more about it. I think what is going on are two things. Firstly, climate change helps these animals live in the Tasmanian marine environment. It helps them reproduce, it helps them grow and live. But more importantly, it has to do with rock lobsters. We've been overfishing rock lobsters like crazy for 40 years, and unfortunately in Tasmania, the only effective predator of the Centrostephanus rodgersii sea urchin are large rock lobsters. That is a rock lobster with a carapace length of 140 millimetres or greater. So by overfishing, and I'll say a bit more about overfishing later on, but the level of overfishing in the rock lobster fishery in Tasmania is quite extraordinary. These predators are basically eliminated from the marine environment because pretty well as soon as a rock lobster becomes legal size on the east coast, someone catches it. So it never gets a chance to grow to be big enough to eat a sea urchin. Now, as you can see, this is a little rock lobster, and you can imagine how much difficulty that little rock lobster would have eating a sea urchin. It just doesn't happen. The only significant predator are large rock lobsters in Tasmanian waters, and that's an important point to remember. Now, when the sea urchins are without a predator, we get these barrens extending, and you can see that this is not a set-up photo. This is a typical bit of urchin barren, and the urchins are extending into the kelp forest. And basically what happens is that when there's rough weather, the kelp sways backwards and forwards and washes the urchins off the rock. But when it's calmer, the urchins move into the kelp and start chewing away, and you just get an incremental increase in urchin barrens. The habitat destruction is incredible. Not only do you have a huge impact on biodiversity and the sort of nature type values, the natural values, but you also get a complete exclusion of fisheries. So where urchin barrens are established, you don't get abalone fishing, you don't get rock lobster fishing, you don't get any other sort of fishing which depends on the reef, because the reef habitat's gone. All of these species that are important to fisheries are basically excluded. 15% of the East Coast reefs have already been lost. We can expect that 50% of the reef will be lost in the very near future. Modelling showed that over 30% of the East Coast reefs will be lost by 2021, and that modelling is based on some really quite extraordinarily optimistic parameters, which I don't think are realistic. So we can expect this to just keep expanding and expanding. Already in some places, for example up off Binalong Bay, 90% of the reef is lost to urchin barrens. This is a huge, huge issue.
It is coming back though.
Sorry?
These barrens are actually coming back.
No, they aren't in fact. One of the problems with an urchin barren is once it's established, it's there basically forever unless you go out and physically remove the urchins.
That's what they're doing.
Well, I'll say more about that later on. We'll decide whether that's a good solution or not. So anyway, look, I've sort of talked about some of the issues surrounding the cause of this problem, and the modelling doesn't take into account things like climate change, or the lack of a cap on recreational fishing numbers, or the loss of productivity due to urchin barrens, or fleet dynamics, which is a fisheries management term for how people fish. Basically, the model assumes that the fishers go out and fish at random, when of course, you know that someone who goes fishing actually targets particular areas, and that undermines the model altogether. But anyway, even forgetting about the model, that predicts a 30% loss of reef by 2021, the wider government reports predicting 50% of loss of the marine habitat on reefs within the near future anyway. Now, as I said earlier, climate change is a big part of this, but the primary driver, and in fact the only one that we in Tasmania can do something about, is the overfishing of rock lobster. We're actually seeing on the east coast rock lobster stocks falling to around 10% of unfished biomass. They've started to recover a little bit from that. If you're not a fisheries manager, I'll try and put that into context. When you're fishing a stock of fish, if your fish stocks get down to around 50%, you should really be panicking at that point. So we in Tasmania have allowed rock lobster stocks along most of the east coast to fall down to 10%, which is an incredible point for any fishery to be at. It's even worse when you consider that this species, the rock lobster, is a key ecological control of centrostephanous barrens. So this sort of explains why we have the centrostephanous barrens expanding at such a rate and causing such a damage to the reefs. Okay, things that we can do. Harvesting and culling. I'm not saying that we shouldn't harvest and cull them. The more that's done, the better. However, there are problems. A study in Wineglass Bay, in shallow reefs, it took them 3 goes to clear out an area of reef in Wineglass Bay. It costs $1.6 million, and of course, unless something's done about the root cause of this problem, if the area is left alone, it will revert back to urchin barrens. Okay. Translocation. Suppose the minister came out last year and said, we're translocating lots of rock lobster to the east coast, and that's going to reduce urchin barrens. It's not going to work. I'll just skip through the next couple of slides if that's all right, but just to briefly point out that by the time the rock lobsters that are translocated grow to be big enough to control urchins, and remember it's the big rock lobster which are critical here. You can have all the little rock lobsters in the world, but unless they're big enough to eat an urchin, they are basically irrelevant to this problem. So by the time those translocated rock lobsters get big enough to eat an urchin, they've basically all been caught, assuming that rock lobster fishers catch just 2 extra rock lobsters a year. Okay, next one. Luckily for rock lobster fishers, we have a nice little map of where these translocated rock lobsters are, so, that probably gives you an idea as to how useful this program is. Okay, keep going if we can. Oh, sorry. If we can just go back to the last slide. Probably one of the more disturbing things is that this translocation program was promoted as a solution to central deafness when there was no evidence to suggest that it would work, and there can be no evidence to suggest that it's going to do any significant good for the problem. Okay, next. Another solution is rebuilding rock lobster stocks. Okay, as with harvesting and culling, I'm all for this. The problem is that rebuilding rock lobster stocks alone is not going to work. We basically need to get the density of large rock lobster, 140 millimetre carapace length and greater, up to around 1 per 1,000 square metres to have a difference. And that's based on research which has been done on rock lobsters and urchin barren formation and recovery by Professor Craig Johnson and his team at UTAS. I'll try and illustrate what I mean by this. If we have two little reefs somewhere off the shore and we have a mixture of boats going out and harvesting rock lobsters, okay, next. They don't fish at random. If these are little reefs out on a sandy bottom, there's no rock lobsters out on the sandy bottom. People target the reefs. Okay. And in fact, generally they'll target one reef over the other. One reef might be closer, it might be more sheltered, it might have more rock lobsters on it. It might just be a prettier place to go fishing. People do not fish at random. Okay. I've drawn a little diagram here. We've got a fairly typical bit of reef that's being attacked by sea urchins. On the top you'll have kelp, around the edges in deeper water you'll have central deafness urchin barrens. Okay, so I've decided to put them on this as a sort of a diagrammatic illustration of what I'm saying. I've luckily got a thing called a rock lobster meter, which measures the numbers of large rock lobster on the reef. And a reminder, these large rock lobster are the only things which are significant for central deafness. So let's assume that the rebuilding program's done wonders and we've got some big predators in the marine environment. Okay, next. Next. And we start off with two reefs, but remember, one of those reefs is being fished a little bit harder than the other. Over time, the reef which is being fished a bit harder is going to basically lose its large rock lobster, and even if there are lots of little rock lobsters, it doesn't make any difference because they can't eat the urchins, okay? And until we get to the point where the reef is basically stuffed, it's destroyed, and we lose a bit of the coast. Now, that is going to be repeated along the coast, and we're just going to find that these reefs keep expanding and expanding. The urchin barrens are going to keep expanding. Okay, we've seen those figures before. Okay. Climate change makes things worse, but it's overfishing of rock lobsters which are critical. Just to really rub salt into the wound, if you're a rock lobster fisher, not only are you losing habitat which supports your fishery, but the outcomes for you as a fisher are pretty dire. I was at a meeting earlier this year in March at the Recreational Fishery Advisory Committee meeting where we were told by an IMAS scientist that just to maintain the rebuilding of the rock lobster stock, we would likely have to see cuts to the recreational catch to 3 per year per fisher. Now, if you're a rock lobster fisherman, you're probably sitting there and thinking, well, gee, that's no good. And remember, that cut is not going to fix central deafness urchins. Okay, next slide. Okay, look, can we fix the central deafness urchin barrens? There are lots of things we can do. I mean, we've heard of culling and harvesting, but so far, and I'll just touch on that a bit more because I didn't get around to talking about that in any detail. Culling and harvesting by divers sounds like a good idea, but it's a bit depth limited. It's hard to operate in deeper water. There are divers now using nitrox, which is a richer mix of basically air. They've added oxygen to the air, or they've mixed oxygen and air to create a mix which allows them to dive a little bit deeper, a little bit longer. But it's really hard to spend time below 20 metres, even 30 metres. Depth limit means that all that reef deeper than 30 metres is completely unprotected from central deafness and will not be recovered in the foreseeable future given our current technology. But look, there are other things we might like to try. We can try autonomous underwater vehicles. That's a bit of a pie in the sky type thing. developing them to use on crown of thorns and the Great Barrier Reef. There's potential for them to be used here, but so far no one's got a project off the ground to use those. It'd be good to try and have some education in the community to realise the extent of this as a problem. And I keep getting away from harvesting and culling, and I'll just give an example as to how, while it's great in certain areas, it's as a solution, it's just not terribly good for an overall solution. In the last year, 550 tonnes of urchins were taken off the east coast. The season, I think, has just finished a few days ago. And that sounds like a lot, but if you do a bit of a back-of-the-envelope type calculation, it actually represents clearing reef, about 8 kilometres long by about 100 metres wide. So, if you draw that on a map of the east coast of Tasmania, it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of the east coast, and it is limited in with respect to the depth, and it's just not a solution. Okay, so what can we do? Well, look, fallowing an area, trying to let the rock lobsters rebuild to densities where they might actually do the work of autonomous underwater vehicles and go out and prey on sea urchins, I think is something that needs to be thought about. The reduction of the catch. I think that marine protected areas might be useful to have, so we can actually identify what the actual impacts of climate change are as opposed to what the impacts of fishing are, because currently we don't have representative marine protected areas on the east coast. We have one unrepresentative no-take marine protected area in Maria Island, but the Bicheno Marine Protected Area is very small. It's more of a recreational/scientific reserve, but it doesn't look at the key habitat which is so important to rock lobster and Centra stephanus, although I have to say that because it's a marine protected area and because there are lots of large rock lobster there, those rock lobster are doing a very good job of protecting those reefs from Centra stephanus. I really think this is a political issue. As I said, I've been talking to various ministers over the last 25 years. We're starting to, the Conservation Trust is starting this year to take a bit of a more proactive and more public position on this, because I don't think talking to ministers has been terribly effective. I think it would be great if we had all the political parties on side. Okay, next. I think it would be great to have people in the community working together to discuss this issue and to come up with some serious solutions for what's a serious problem. Last year, as a member of 3 government committees, the Abalone, Crustacean and Recreational Fishery Advisory Committee, I initiated and got passed a recommendation from each of those groups to have an ongoing working group made up of key stakeholders to talk about and work out solutions to this problem. If it means that there's a big cut in fisheries, well then if people are aware of what the problem is and the scale of the problem, they can basically make the hard decisions if they're aware of what the outcomes are, because the reality is if we don't do anything, we are seeing wholesale destruction of not only reefs but iconic fisheries on the east coast, particularly the recreational east coast rock lobster fishery, and I would think that's a really sad thing. I'm just about to finish. There's more information from the Conservation Trust website, a bit of a plug there. Next photo. But look, really, the main thing I wanted to get across today is just that we have an amazing marine environment in Tasmania. Even if you are just walking along the coastline, this is looking out towards Freycinet Peninsula during a bit of a squall. I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you in this room that we are very, very lucky to have this part of our state. And once you get underwater, you start to see even more interesting things, and it just keeps going. Okay, I think we're just about finished, and yep, thanks. And that's my website, and thanks for your attention. What sort of depth the sea urchins go to? Well, that's a bit of a moving target. Initially, the thought was that they went down to about 35 to 40 metres. I've actually seen them about 15 years ago. I saw them down at 55 metres off Shooten Island. The current wisdom suggests that they get down to 65 metres. I'm not actually convinced that there is a true depth limit for them, because I've seen them become very well established on a sponge garden. And remember, sponge gardens sort of extend from 30 metres down to at least 80 metres, which is the deepest I've dived on reef here. I've dived down to 100 metres in Tasmania, but that was on a sort of a sediment bottom, but on reef. So look, there's a wreck called the Nord, which is just north of Tasman Island, which I've been diving for since 1979, in fact. And just beside the wreck of the Nord, which was an old ship which went down in 1915, there's a reef covered in sponges, and it's quite a pretty little reef. And if you get bored with the wreck, you can swim over and look at the reef. Until about 18 months ago, that little reef was looking really good. But about 18 months ago, I dived it, and I noticed around the 38-metre mark on the reef, there was a whole bunch of little urchins eating away at the sponges. And so whether that reef remains a pristine habitat, I don't know. But so look, as far as the depth goes, in summary, they tend to do really, really well between 10 metres and 30 metres, and particularly 20 metres to 30 metres. People used to think that they wouldn't come into the shallows, and I think that's one of the reasons why the abalone industry didn't jump up and down and have, spastic attacks at the start, because they kind of thought, well, if they don't come up into shallower than 10 metres, that's our fishery looked after. Unfortunately, we are seeing them up into 10 metres and shallower, and as I said earlier on that slide, if you can remember, when there's rough weather moving the kelp around, it tends to protect the reef. The urchins don't do very well if they're being swept off the rocks, but you get a bit of calm weather, the urchins will move up and start chewing away at the kelp, and it disappears, so they'll keep moving up and incrementally extending the area of the barrens. So I think we can expect to see urchins extending from 5 metres down to at least 65 metres. Yeah.
Any thought being given to other sorts of biological control? The most population urban bust things happen because there's something comes along that kills them off, whether it's bacteria or whatever, virus.
Yeah, look, people have thought about it. In Australia, we always have that nightmare of the cane toad to remind us that we have to be careful of introducing biological controls, and it's probably quite a reasonable concern. Best case scenario would be if these huge populations of sea urchins in a kind of slightly unusual habitat. Certainly they do well in Tasmanian waters, and they have been doing well in Tasmanian waters probably before climate change became the huge change agent that it is now. But maybe a virus or some other pathogen will get into the system and kill them all off. There are experiences in other parts of the world where urchins and or sea stars have been basically almost completely wiped out by disease organisms. That's probably wishful thinking. I'd be very cautious about introducing anything directly into Tasmania. In New South Wales, they have another predator, not only rock lobster, but a fish called the blue groper. And one of the explanations for why urchin barrens are very widespread in New South Wales is because blue groper were a very popular fish to catch, and particularly spearfish, in fact. And that population was just really hit hard from the 60s through till when they were protected, which I think was in the late 80s. So there are predators. I've heard suggestions that we should introduce blue gropers into Tasmania. Again, I'd be very cautious about actually doing it because of some of the unforeseen consequences that might develop. There's every possibility that they'll come down here anyway because of climate change. I actually remember seeing a blue groper up off St Helens probably back in about 1980. Probably about 1980. I'm not 100% sure, but I think I saw one in the distance, and I think they have been seen here. Whether they become established, whether they become a useful predator, I don't know. Another suggestion is doing a thing called liming. I think industry at the moment, whether you're talking in government, they tend to like the idea of harvesting as a solution. In fact, the harvest industry that is going on is heavily subsidised by taxpayer money, and it's possibly not even sustainable without that subsidy. I was at a meeting earlier this week where it was suggested that a more efficient use of that money wouldn't be to subsidise harvesting, but would be to simply subsidise people going out and smashing the urchins as a direct culling effect. That's something that's a live issue. I don't know. But people sort of see that as a win-win situation where there's a self-sustaining industry harvesting urchins, which protects the reef for the abalone industry. It maybe doesn't protect the deeper reef, but who cares about that? It doesn't necessarily protect the recreational rock lobster fishery, but maybe we can live with that. I mean, I don't agree with that approach, but that seems to be the sort of the thought processes which are going on. Another solution is a thing called liming, which is basically dumping quicklime onto the reef. Now, quicklime is a caustic material. It actually sounds worse than it is because unless you're a sea urchin, then it's pretty horrible being hit by quicklime, which basically dissolves your tissues and kills you very quickly. But most other reef organisms and fish and things like that are not terribly affected by it. But it's kind of a mechanistic way of approaching the problem. It's who's going to pay for it? How effective is it? Are there environmental impacts which are unacceptable? It's still unknown. So look, as I said earlier, once these urchin barrens are established, they are basically there for the foreseeable future. One of the really interesting things about these sea urchins, is that they basically eat themselves out of house and home. So they clear a reef of usually algae, but also they can clear sponges and other things. And then they just sit there, and they basically sit there starving. Unfortunately, they don't starve to death. They just sit there. And if something turns up, they'll move over and eat it. But they can survive indefinitely. And that means that, we've lost 15% of the reef. We can basically say that's gone. It's my belief that we've lost, basically 30% in the next couple of years. There's still no structured government response to this, and there's no evidence-based solution. And if you can imagine the same thing happening on land, it's incredible. Yep, sorry.
Just supposing you could get agreement for it, how long would it take if the rock lobsters were never fished at all? If that was stopped, how long would it take for things to recover? And is the kelp recoverable?
Good news on both fronts, I guess. The kelp will recover quite well if you remove the urchins. The thing about shallow marine environment in Tasmania and temperate waters generally is it's adapted to deal with storms and storm damage. And so, as long as there's some left there to reproduce, if you remove the factor which is causing the problem, the reefs do recover, and they recover very well. As far as how long it would take, if we closed down the East Coast fishery, there was a report which came out around 10 years ago, actually probably about 8 years ago, and that indicated that a closure of the commercial fishery on the East Coast for between 5 and 10 years would increase the density of large rock lobster up to the point where they would probably at least prevent further expansion of urchin barrens. Unfortunately, you can have all the rock lobster in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the established urchin barrens are going to recover, because the rock lobsters are probably not going to go out into the open to go and eat those urchins. So again, it's really important, I think, to try and get rock lobster numbers up to prevent further extension of the urchin barrens, and I think that should be a priority. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened.
So if you had that as a priority to increase the rock lobster numbers, and in conjunction with that you were doing other things to try to crash the population of the urchins, then you might have some chance of getting a balance.
Difference in breeding capacity, which breeds more quicker.
Both rock lobster and sea urchins are pretty good breeders.
Are the urchins actually breeding down here? I heard a report from Sora the other day that 5% of them is all they think, but breeding down here.
Given that they pump out millions of eggs, it only takes 5% of them to cause a problem. So look, I don't know what the breeding success is, and I don't think anyone has done any study to say that every urchin on every reef is a successful reproducer. In fact, you know, let's assume that none of the urchins in Tasmania reproduce effectively. We're still getting potentially eggs coming down from New South Wales. So look, the problem in an ecological sense, that the egg production is almost a lost cause, but it's also almost irrelevant, because we can expect for the foreseeable future that there's always going to be lots of eggs in the water, lots of larval sea urchins floating around waiting for somewhere to settle on the bottom. That's fine, okay, they're going to be there in huge numbers. The key point, the one place where people can influence this is what happens to them on the reef. And as I said earlier, in Tasmania, the only thing that we can effectively manage are numbers of large rock lobster in the environment. I mean, we can do culling and harvesting, and in some areas I think that's, you know, probably a really good thing to pursue. But as a general overall solution, you know, getting those numbers of large rock lobster up is really important. Now, to put this into sort of a bit more of a context, you know, we do have quite a few small rock lobsters in the marine environment because the population is rebuilding. It's still at ridiculously low levels, and in fact, for many years they said they wanted to rebuild the population to 20% as a target. I think I managed to embarrass them enough so that they now say it's an interim target and that they're going to keep building the population. But it's a crazy place for fishery to be, to have, you know, your biomass at around 10%, even 20% of the unfished biomass.
Why isn't there a moratorium, full stop?
Well, I don't know.
The same thing that they did with the scarps.
Yeah, look, I don't know. I think people are embarrassed to take
Because
ownership.
everyone wants to eat it, but why can't we educate the population to eat it?
Well, that's what I'm here to do today. And if everyone in this room goes out and tells 10 people, and then they tell 10 people, you know, this is a start. And
Urchins could be the market. I mean, a lot of people love to eat black sea urchin.
Yep. Look, I think that could be part of the solution, but unfortunately the market for sea urchin roe is pretty competitive and it's pretty costly to harvest them.
Out to Asia.
I mean, you know, you sort of look at fisheries and it's quite a typical thing for fisheries to be overfished. So, you know, why can't we overfish the urchin? But unfortunately there's some economic barriers. But I'll just say one more thing about age and growth and how long it takes. As I said, there's probably quite a few little rock lobsters out there, but, you know, as I said, they reach legal size and then pretty soon after that most of them get caught. Unless you're a Tatslotto equivalent winning rock lobster, you don't grow to be a big rock lobster on the East Coast. From the time that they become legally sized, it probably takes them around 5 years to get up to that magic 140mm carapace length where they start to control urchin numbers. And so there is that period. Yeah.
Would we need rock lobsters in play proportions to be able to keep up with the amount of urchins? I mean, it does seem like an impossible...
Well, look, as I said, there's actually been research on this, and if we can get the density of rock lobsters up to 1 per 1,000 square metres, that's enough. And that's been shown by research. That will stop urchin barrens expanding and it will stop new barrens forming. Now that's not... And the modelling has shown, if I refer back to that paper of about 8 years ago, the modelling, scientific modelling shows that around 5 to 10 years moratorium would result in a solution. However, you know, as we're waiting for the rock lobsters to grow out, we're also seeing the barrens expand. You know, it's a bit of a race, and who wins at the end, I don't know. Yep.
As a part-time urchin, I've got probably bought 70, 80 tonne of these things. I can see the difference on the bottom. My hose length, the whole East Coast. We are pushing it out deeper. I understand it's a problem. It is going to be a problem out wider. We can keep removing the weeds. We can keep going on with the pruning and stop it from coming in. And I've seen where the bottom's grown back once we've removed the urchins after they've been, you know, like for instance up at St Helens there, at Billon Bay, we're getting 5 metres, you know, and that now you can see it's grown back. I think we've got to be careful They're basically taking everything nowadays, the processors. They found a market, they couldn't get rid of C grade, now they can get rid of C grade into Japan. And I think if we stop the diving, that's the, I don't care if they stop it, because I'd rather see the bottom come back. I have another job I can do. But the bottom line is, if we stop, whatever we're doing out wide doesn't happen. They've shown in New South Wales it comes back twice as bad, and you've lost your processor, you've lost your divers, you've lost your momentum. So I think it's important that if you can introduce these big crayfish, which I just can't imagine them eating 500 tonne a year or whatever. That's what we pulled out this year, is 500 tonne.
550 actually.
Yeah. Like that's all. We've still got this back quarter to go yet. They're catching them at the moment still. It's not even the time to catch them, but the market is there.
Look, I applaud your efforts. I think it's great. What I am saying though is that if you look at the wider reef area, it's still just a drop in the ocean. Now, I recently heard that, in fact, just a couple of days ago, that you guys are taking urchins off the barrens themselves and selling those successfully, which is really great. For those of you who are possibly not as familiar as I am with this, you've got these starving urchins out on the barrens, and because they're starving, their egg mass, their roe, isn't terribly big, and it was always considered that those were of no value to the fishery, but people are starting to find a market for those. So look, I keep it up. I think there will become a time when there may be a conflict between harvesting for profit and controlling urchins, but that's a question further down the track, and I'm all for harvesting to go on.
The processor has also said that he doesn't need that extra money from the government.
Yep, well that's great, and that's really good.
On TV, so.
Yeah. If that was the case, then we might have harvesting and culling as well. But for me, and for
when you say culling, are you saying culling out in deeper waters, or are you saying in the shallows?
anywhere.
Then if you get rid of the industry, it's a chicken before the egg, concentrate on fair enough on the outside, the deeper stuff. But if someone goes on and smashes them, we don't have an industry.
Oh, absolutely. And look, that's a really interesting question. But I was at an abalone Fishery Advisory Committee meeting on Monday, and this was in fact the second meeting in recent times where this was discussed, and there was at both meetings, and look, I can say this in public because we aren't restricted in what we say about what goes on in those meetings, that people were thinking, well, we'd get more bang for our buck if we spent the money on simply smashing the urchins as opposed to collecting them for harvest. Now, me, I'm a bit of an agnostic as far as that goes. I don't particularly mind if you take them for seafood. I don't mind if you smash them. What I don't want to see is them sitting there being uncontrolled and continuing to destroy the reef. I guess that would require a lot of marine reserves spaced along the east coast, because it's a fairly typical experience of marine protected areas. If they notate that, you get stocks of your target species, whether they're rock lobster or morlun or whatever, they populate the marine reserve, and then the density of fish gets big enough, and so for most species they want to move out into fresh fields, and so the experience has been recorded around the world that people who go fishing like fishing on the edge of marine reserves because that's where all the fish are. So yes, it could have an impact. I would suggest though that marine protected areas are possibly more use as a scientific resource than as a solution, just because, for the politics of having a marine protected area in such numbers that it would have an effect, are pretty difficult. Yeah. So look, I think there are a variety of solutions, and I have to say that I don't have the solution, and that's why I keep promoting these public forum type groups. And I did forget to say that although 3 meetings endorse this, 3 government committees, the government hasn't put that into place. We aren't getting it happening. So, yep.
Just thinking of the commercial fishery, it's unlikely they're going to be very supportive of a moratorium on rock lobster if that's their livelihood, but I mean, how feasible is it for them to switch their prey, if you like, from rock lobster to urchin, even if they get a subsidy from the government?
Not at all. It's a very, very different fishery. With rock lobster, the commercial fishery is based on pots off boats. The urchin fishery is a dive fishery. I could be a bit rude here and say most of the rock lobster fishers are old farts like me and aren't going to jump in the water and catch low-value urchins when they can go and pick up a $100 rock lobster in a pot.
Oh, yeah, no, I think that. But if they used pots and put kelp as bait in the pots to get...
No, the urchins aren't that mobile. And the urchins tend to just sit on the bottom. At night, in crevices, they come out at night. If they're in the middle of an urchin barren, they just sit there all day. But they don't go hunting. In fact, they basically can sit there and wait till a bit of drift kelp comes along, which they'll eat. So they don't actually behave that way. But the economics are also completely against it because, you've got a very low-value urchin compared to a very high-value rock lobster. So, unfortunately, there isn't that transferability. However, a couple of other things to bear in mind. There are between 12 and 14 dedicated commercial rock lobster fishers on the East Coast. Dedicated means that they can't fish, they claim that they can't fish anywhere except the East Coast because their boats don't allow them to go around the West Coast easily. I mean, people will dispute that, but that's the claim. There is talk of making the East Coast a recreational only area. Another thing that you could do is have a maximum size limit once you do get rock lobsters coming through, even if you temporarily close an area to allow the population to recover, if you have a maximum size limit there, then you're protecting those large rock lobster. Because at the moment, they grow, the longer they live, the bigger they grow, the more chance there is of them disappearing because they've been caught.
They only have a minimum?
They only have a minimum size. So look, I think it's going to become a bit of a political shit fight, excuse my language, in the near future. I'm on the committee of Tarfish, which is a recreational peak fishing body in Tasmania, and I'll say straight up that I'm not speaking on behalf of Tarfish, but I do have links with the recreational fishing community, and I think that once people start to realise that they're going to have their catch limited to 3 per year, or that their reef is disappearing on the East Coast, where 80% of recreational fishing effort takes place for rock lobster, that's going to create some huge political pressures. Where that heads, I don't know, but it's quite a febrile environment to operate in, I think, at the moment.
How big do the rock lobsters have to be before they breed?
Breed? Well, the legal size limit is supposed to protect them to at least breed for 1 or 2 seasons. Rock lobsters and invertebrates in general are kind of a bit hard to get a handle on because their growth rate depends on the amount of food and the water temperature and other environmental factors. So it's a bit different to looking at a rabbit or something and saying, look, they're this big. That's when they start breeding and this is how long they live. But anyway, so they will start reproducing in Tasmania once they reach legal size here in most places for that size limit. And the recent research has shown that our local rock lobsters do self-recruit, which means that, for many years people were saying, we shouldn't have to worry about protecting rock lobsters to breed because their eggs and larvae, they just go off to New Zealand and help the New Zealanders. Okay? But in fact, there is self-recruitment. Sadly, the most important part of Tasmania for self-recruitment is the northwest tip of Tasmania, because if you know how water moves around Tasmania, you'll know that there's a net flow from west to east in Bass Strait, and the Lewin Current comes down the west coast. So eggs that are produced in the northwest of Tasmania by rock lobster basically have a chance to go all around Tasmania. We have our biomass on the northwest tip of Tasmania is also down around 10% of unfished, and egg production is also incredibly low. So, the main source of eggs, the main source of recovery for rock lobster in Tasmania has been incredibly overfished and is not doing as good as it should.
Sounds like a good
Yes, there has. I actually mentioned it a couple of minutes ago. I should have mentioned it earlier in the talk, but the idea of having a maximum size limit is to protect the large rock lobsters so that once they reach that critical size, they aren't at so much risk of being killed by fishing. I think it makes all the other management solutions easier, but it's important to remember that by itself a maximum size limit's probably not much use because, you know, remember on the east coast of Tasmania to reach maximum size limit, that little rock lobster has to survive several years without being caught. And unfortunately, the way fishing is at the moment, there's a term for it in fisheries management, it's called knife edge fishing, which basically means that once rock lobster reach their legal limit, they're basically removed from the fishery very quickly by the fishing. I think what you see is that people have recreational fishers tend to be in more shallow water because most recreational fishers don't have pot haulers, and it's really hard to lift a cray pot from 50 metres or 100 metres. In fact, if you go offshore where the commercial fishers operate, there's also a very strong current, so you don't have just a normal cray pot, you have a big heavy cray pot, but they have mechanical pot haulers, which is like a little sort of a winch, which you wrap the pot line around the winch and it sort of reels the pot up without you having to lift this heavy thing.
Most rock lobsters would be shallower dwellers as opposed to...
Yeah. So look, to give a bit more detail, rock lobsters do quite well in quite shallow water, but they are naturally found throughout the rocky reef system. In my diving experience, I mean, I see them at 70 metres and they're quite happy there. I've seen them all the way up into the shallows. They probably don't do really well in 2 metres of water in bull kelp, where there's huge wave action, but you certainly see them in 5 to 10 metres of water quite commonly. The reason that pots by recreational fishers are set close into shore is more of a logistical thing. People don't like pulling pots up, and people sort of think, oh, look, no one else has managed to get a pot in that close to the shore, so I think I'll have a bit of luck there. Getting back to shifting baselines, I actually did a dive in Bicheno. I don't know if you know Bicheno, from the Gulch around to Warbs Bay where the breakwall is. I used to dive there in the 80s, and there used to be a dive site called the Cray Tubes, and you can imagine why it was called the Cray Tubes, because crayfish, or as we call them now due to marketing purposes, rock lobster, used to be there in abundance. So anyway, I did this dive on a rebreather. It took me a couple of hours swimming around, and being on a rebreather, I didn't have a time there really. So I swam all the way along the coast from the Gulch where the fishing boats tie up at the jetty around into Warbs Bay. In the 80s, I could have jumped in along that coast and picked up a couple of rock lobster easily. On that particular dive, this occurred about 9 years ago, I didn't see a single rock lobster. Okay, so that reef habitat, you could go in and you could look in holes where I knew that I'd seen rock lobsters back in the 80s, and the holes were empty, no rock lobster. So, fishing pressure is such that the places where people used to go fishing and fish successfully are no longer providing fish, and if you're starting out, if you've started out fishing since the early 90s, you sort of think, oh, that's normal. But if you remember back to the good old days, like I do, I can go back to places where I saw, photographed, even, dare I say it, caught rock lobster, and those habitats are empty.
But how feasible is it to suggest that the whole industry in recreational fishing and rock lobster is on the verge of collapse anyway? So, if they carry on for 5 or 10 years, they'll be basically extinct. So why not give the whole reef system a chance and have a moratorium now? The trouble with the moratorium, as soon as it finishes, then everybody just goes hell for leather and takes all the bigger crayfish and problems back to where it was again.
Yep, that's a very perceptive question. Look, I actually think it is quite reasonable, particularly with recreational fishers. I've been on the Recreational Fishery Advisory Committee and Tarfish Committee, and again, I'm not speaking for Tarfish, but both groups and other people in the wider community are actually quite sympathetic to that idea of a moratorium. Because, the reality is, what do we do? Do we keep on business as usual and have no fishery at all in 10 years? 15 years? Or do we take a bit of pain for a few years now and then maybe have a fishery in the future? It's always a problem closing an area and then opening it up to fisheries. I mean, that's whether it's a commercial fishery or a recreational fishery, it's sort of like, the starter gun at the Olympic 100-metre dash. Everyone goes and it can be mayhem. There are ways around it. There's having tags and more limited fishing. I think with the recreational fishery, there's going to be some very hard questions and answers in the near future, like what is a fair number of rock lobster to take? How do we manage that? I was in Oregon in 2001, and I remember walking along the beach and seeing a sign, and it had all the fisheries regulations, and it was to do with abalone, but for one species of abalone, the limit was 1 abalone per person per year. Now, I mean, how do you police that for a start? But, that's how things can happen. You can have season openings which are measured in hours. The commercial salmon fishery in Canada, if you go there at the right time of the year, you'll see all these commercial boats sitting around in bays anchored up, and they're basically waiting for midnight for the fishery to start. They go start, and the fishery might only be open for 12 or 24 hours, and it closes, and then they go and do a sampling process. The government goes out and samples the catch and decides, we can open it up for another 24 hours. So there are very, very draconian fisheries management techniques, which, in Tasmania we're sort of used to fairly free and open and anything goes type things. There are, to be fair, there are some very strict rules about fishing in Tasmania, but in comparison we have fairly open access. And I think it may come down to choosing between the existence of a fishery and not having a fishery. I mean, for me, I mainly go diving for photos. It's really hard for me to carry a couple of big underwater camera systems and catch crayfish at the same time. But the other thing is, I go diving and if I see a rock lobster or a crayfish, I just feel a bit sorry for it because, it's the last rock lobster on the reef. I don't want to be the one that catches it. I wouldn't want to be the one that catches it. So, for me, it's the fishery's already closed because it's just in such a terrible state.
But how easy is it to get that across to recreational fishers, or does it come to a point where they get so far that they keep going trying to fish rock lobster and they don't get any, that ultimately they sort of give up because there aren't any there? It's too late.
Yep. Look, there are two barriers that I see to this. Firstly is the sliding, shifting baselines. People don't realise the extent of the problem. And then that's an education thing as well, because people aren't being told. The people who take an interest and are on these committees are aware and they're actually sympathetic to these sorts of outcomes. The other problem, though, is not only shifting baselines in education, but it's political. Our current minister doesn't want to close the fishery down.
Well, it's a vote loser.
Yeah. Well, what is the bigger vote loser? Losing the fishery forever or closing it down for a few years? I don't know. We live in a democracy.
Yeah, but if you're an MP now and you're worried about re-election in 3 years,
yep.
If the fishery closes in 10 years, you might be retired by then, you might not care.
That's exactly right. And so it's really interesting when these politicians who, over the last couple of decades, people are always saying, look, I want to leave the fishery for my children and grandchildren. I'm a keen fisherman. But the reality is, as I hope I've illustrated tonight, a little bit different.